Well, hello, everyone. My name is Mit Joyner, and you've joined the Essential Chat with Mit. I want to say that it's summertime, and summer is supposed to be easy, but at the conclusion of today's broadcast, we're going to give you all a summertime assignment. So sit back and get ready to hear your assignment. So I want to say Happy Pride Month, everyone. It's the month of June. Again, my name is Mit Joyner, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I want to thank everyone to this broadcast. You're seeing something different on the Essential Chat with Mit. Thanks to Dr. Slater, we have done something a little bit different, and that is to add ASI interpreters. See, we want in social work to have an inclusive village. And it is important that social workers, when they see that something's not there, they speak up, stand up, and take action. And that's exactly what she did. And from that, there was no question about should we, could we. We're glad to let you know that Rarity will be with us for the first 15 minutes, and then it will be Samuel. Then Rarity will come back and Samuel. And I welcome them to our essential chat with Mitt. Because, see, that's what these words that we've been buzzing around DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion means making sure that at every level you represent all of the people. And at times, you need a reminder of who's not at that table of change. And when they're not there, you do what is necessary as a leader to make sure that happens. And so that's what we're talking about today. Now, I always start with a song because I happen to see one of our guests, Erica, can sing, but I can't sing. So I have not been able to sing these songs. But I try to think because music resonates with me all the time. And it wasn't until like 15 minutes ago that I thought of Rosie Perez in Do the Right Thing, standing there boxing and hitting that bag. And that's what we've got to do today. We've got to fight the powers that be. We've got to fight those institutionalized systems that we have that perpetuate and constantly look at things through one lens and fails to look at the kaleidoscope of the beauty of our country. So, fight the power to be. Yet our best trained, best educated, best equipped, best prepared troops refuse to fight. As a matter of fact, it's to say that they would rather switch than fight. You see, all social workers out there, when you get that degree, be it on the BSW level, the MSW level, the PhD level, whether you are micro, meso, macro, you all are obligated to fight the powers to be. You are a social worker. And far too often, what we're finding in our social work profession, that there are some that will say, well, you know what, I don't really practice advocacy, or I don't really work at the macro level, or I only want to see my clients who come in here and tell me their issues. Well, I'm telling you all, get ready because you all have a responsibility and a commitment to take the micro, the meso, and the macro and put it all together like like that bag is hanging on. And you need to punch. Think of me like Rosie Perez. Punch those systems that constantly only look at one lens. So I'd like you to put your name in the chat, where you're from. I want you to ask questions. I don't want you to leave the room because, see, social workers are always engaged in heavy, hard conversations. When I go around this country talking for NASW, people will say to me, social work is hard. Darn tootin', it's hard. It is one of the hardest professions out there. That's what you signed up for. But You must have the ability to actively listen to those barriers and those obstacles that people are trying to hurdle. Now, I always get back to, because I'm an old soul, I'll be honest. I didn't graduate yesterday, I graduated a while ago. But when I graduated from Howard University, we learned all of these theories, and they were called racial identity theories. Howard at that particular time was always talking about the motherland, about Black people as free and what we brought, our contributions. It freed us up to think. But they also let us know we've got to look at the theories for other people as well. And so it took us down a lane where we're now using words like anti racism or ally, right? And we are pretending that it's something new when I don't think it's new at all. I think it's being revisited into different language. Janet Helms talked about the white consciousness model. And when you look at white privilege and the white consciousness model, it lines itself up to everything that she talked about. Oh, I'm white. I don't really see color. Everybody's pink. Everybody's blue. Oh, come on. And again, that I have brown skin. And you see my color, and to ignore my color is wrong. Yet, I can't speak for everyone that wears brown skin. We have to understand that Black people are as diverse as they can be. And so we're going to talk some about that. We're going to talk about the fact, and I have to recognize that I say 20 people died this week, mainly who are Mexican American. Now, again, I was saddened with my own profession because we always do these things, our thoughts and prayers. But what actions are we going to take? What actions? Why does an 18-year-old have the right to have something that harms kids? So why do I say 20? Because one of those teachers' loved ones, her husband, went home and died of a broken heart. And we have to recognize that. But it's time for social work to be up in the forefront of change. Last session, we've had 3 of these hard conversations. Our last one was about the AAPI community and Stop the Hate. It was a great show. I encourage everyone to go watch Grey's Anatomy, at the great work that they worked with those people who published Grey's Anatomy, with the producers of that, because they were recognized. But we know that the Asian American and Pacific Islander community is so diverse that we cannot collectively look at it as one. And we know our Latinx community is as diverse as well. And so we're going to talk about that. And we'll talk about our indigenous population. When I taught 497 recognized tribes way back in the 70s that were all different, but lived in peaceful coexistence on Turtle Island. And we need to understand that. And then we also need to understand why people don't want to take and examine the history that we have. But our purpose today is to examine. We'll have Elspeth talk a little bit and help us with this. White privilege. Social work is made up 69% are white people. If social work is going to change, white people have got to get on board and take the lead on some things. Maybe ally is the wrong word. Maybe we need to play with that, because ally just allows you to sit back and support me. I don't need any more support. I'm tired. I know the issues that I have, but I need somebody else to stand with me to bring about change. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So people, get back, get your drink, do whatever you need to do at home. All we can have on screen is water, but I really wish it was something different. And let us have a real conversation. I know these conversations are hard. They're not here to trigger anyone. They're not here to poke fun at any group. They're here to really examine. So I'm going to first start with someone that I met a while ago. And now I just have to tell you about myself. When I meet somebody that becomes a sister girl, I just have to call it on out. And Stephen E. Smith became my sister girl. We were supposed to talk for an hour about something, and we were just talking and talking and talking. And I don't even think we talked about what we were supposed to talk about. But Stephen E. Smith is a co-founder and managing partner. Stephen E. is Sophia's lead authority on operationalizing equity, executive project management, and organizational structure and design. She has led a number of efforts to align not for profits with community investments, with a special emphasis on large scale transformation. She goes into these systems, lets them know what is not working, and helps them get to a more inclusive environment. So, first, Stephen E., welcome, and I'll have you come on and give your remarks.
Thank you so much for that fire, that reminder, and like you said, that call to action that all of us will build upon. And so, yes, my name is Stephen E. Smith. I'm excited to be in this space and build community with each of my fellow panelists, including Rarity and Samuel, our ASL interpreters. I just would like to say that when we talk about this fight the power, and I love what you've challenged us with, and when we talk about whether you want to call it allyship or being a co-conspirator, whatever it is, that it begins with our own analysis of self. And so as we talk about systems change, which I'm all about, the work that we are focused on at SOFIX Solutions is about operationalizing equity. Because far too often when we begin to think about change, typically we just look at behaviors. But for whatever behavioral change that needs to happen, we should also be looking at systems. And so I'm really excited to be able to impart that perspective and to share this space. One of the other pieces that I'll say when you talk about DEI, and you are so right when you talk about your experience at Howard. I attended Fisk University, shout out to historically Black colleges and universities. But at Fisk, we have been talking about these things like so many of our other institutions. But I want to also introduce this B for belonging. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I like to remind us of the power of belonging. That belonging is not only the goal, but it's the glue, it's the evidence. And so even with our ASL interpreters joining us today, that it is the intention not only to have a practical sensibility to that, but also to remind those that are part of the ASL community that you too belong in this conversation. And so this belonging piece is extremely important. And I'm excited to join in community. I also want to recognize our friend Pat. Thank you to everybody that's tuning in. You are right. And we also want to lift up the horrific shooting in Buffalo. And where we are at in today's time, there could be probably a city or a town that we can mention every single day that are experiencing these travesties. And so if we want to talk about the behavioral change that we want to see in people, we must talk about the systems change that we want to see. And not just in our policies and laws, but also what is producing, what is contributing to these things. And so I look forward to engaging in this conversation. Thank you, Mit.
Thank you. Kara, you're next, and I think I owe you congratulations. Didn't you just walk and get your PhD? Congratulations on that. We need to celebrate people too, because that's what's important. That's why we do. But Kara is an active advocate and reflectionist for radicalized, marginalized, and oppressive communities in public and secondary education settings, while promoting cultural humility in research, academia, and clinical practice. So, without further ado, I mean, all of these bios are real long, but I'm just taking a sentence that kind of pushes itself out. I'm going to have you speak to us. You and I happen to be on something that Adelphi did several months ago, and I knew I wanted to circle back to both you and Erica. So, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, it was you, me, and Erica, and I thank you so much, everybody, for the congratulations, because it's something that one of the things that they told me when I defended my dissertation, for example, was I cried, and I'm not like that. A lot of people who know me, I can be very stoic. You know, it's after a while you're that social worker, right? You hold it together. But the main reason why I was crying is because of the fact that I am one of the few, only by a handful of Filipino Americans who are social workers with a PhD. And so to hold the weight of that is something that that weighs heavily, and it's something that allows me to also be more sensitive in working with my clients, with my students, and I really, I really do embrace that. And one of the things, I am so grateful to be here and so honored. And one of the things that has come up is my intersectionality. And a lot of people will see me on one end of the continuum. I'm seen as Asian American. On the other end of the continuum, from another community, I could be seen as mixed or multiracial. And I also have something that's very, very hidden, and that is my religious identity. And so I can represent so many communities. I'm very lucky in that sense. But growing up, I did not feel that way. And I'm still constantly learning. So I'm definitely here to make a difference. And one of the things that I really, really love and why I got my doctorate is so that I can make a difference with those in the social work community. For example, I did not learn about critical race theory until I was in my coursework in my doctoral program. Now, I graduated with my master's in 1997. Okay. Back then, we did not speak about critical race theory. And so it's something that where I find that a lot of us have to teach ourselves, even though we are in that classroom. And I see heads nodding, so I'm grateful to have that. So I'm here to be transparent and vulnerable and to talk about how we can really help each other. It's not a competition. It's not about one community over the other, right? Like, exactly. We are not here to point fingers and place the blame. It's about working together. And that's why I'm here.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Elspeth Slater. I actually, you are the reason why we even are having this. I read an article that you have, and I was intrigued. I think it was in the new social worker with my friend Linda, who I just love and admire her work. And there it was in black and white. And so she is a professor of social work at Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts, who researches and consults in the intersectional areas of race, ethnicity, and disability. So, with that said, I am going. I know that you're off to you're off going somewhere in a couple of days, and I thank you for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thank you so much, Professor Joyner, and I'm really honored to be here. I do just want to lift up my intersectionalities. I identify as a white woman and also as a disabled person, and very proud of that cultural identity. So I appreciate the speakers talking about that. So, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to be an ally, or even better, a co-conspirator. And so I want to talk about that word for a moment. I really take my marching orders on this from Dr. Bettina Love, who's a Black educator. And she talks about the need to move from talking about allies to co-conspirators, which my co-speaker mentioned a bit. And so the idea is that allies, it starts to look like they use the terms, they read the books, but they don't necessarily take the action. And if it's time to act, they're not there. So being a co-conspirator is about stepping up, putting something on the line for somebody, taking a risk for someone, using your privilege, and moving beyond Instagram posts and candlelight vigils in response to things like Buffalo or Texas. It's fostering meaningful responses and tangible actions. And I also take guidance from the wonderful Black scholar, deceased now, Bell Hooks, who says what we do is more important than what we say or what we say we believe. And my work with my colleagues at my institution is a lot about keeping allies in the room from these dictates. And it's very difficult work to keep people involved and to get people involved. And some of the ideas I have about how to do that, keeping people involved, really center around modeling for people, throwing yourself under the bus as a white person in terms of outwardly talking about when you're racist or you've done something racist, helping people to not be so afraid of that word, or, it could be ableist, could be transphobic, right? I do a lot of work to try and get organizational leadership on board with the modeling as well, building anti-racist work into our meetings, making it part of what we do, helping white people to see that it's our responsibility to fight racism. We can work with white people on talking about their own racism, modeling co-conspiratorship, modeling being okay about talking about white privilege and unpacking that, and also modeling not being a white savior at the same time. And I think central to all this for white folks, I'm speaking generally, but it's my view, is that we have to practice seeing whiteness. And this is the subject of the article that Professor Joyner talked about, which we'll share in the chat. If we practice seeing whiteness, this can make white people more aware of the social advantages they experience, given the ways that whiteness is the norm in our society. It's the air we breathe. And this will help people to reduce their discomfort at having difficult dialogues around racism, ableism, etc. So that when they're confronted with information about injustices, racial injustices, or evidence of their own racism even, that is a help. So seeing whiteness can improve racial awareness lenses people have and their capacity for being a co-conspirator that does meaningful anti-racism work in social work settings. So those are my initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm going to encourage all of you to begin throwing things in the chat. My next guest, it's really not a guest because she sits on the board with me, is Alice K. Locklear, who is a Cherokee from the Lumbee Native, holding rank of full professor at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. She's made so many historical markers. She's the first Native American female in the social work department to hold a PhD. And I know, Kara, you can, you probably both are thinking of that as you represent when you get that degree. You not just do that for yourself, you're doing that for so many. So Kara is a member of our board. Kara is not a member of our board, but Kay is a member of our board. And she has contributed significantly to our board as she's helped us look at a different lens that we hadn't looked at before. So with that, Alice K. Locklear, I will let you get started. And I thank you for joining me again. I always call on her. Kay, can you do this? And we're going to develop more people we can call on, Kay. Okay. You're on mute. You must be on mute.
Thank you so much, President Mit, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. This is actually something that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. These difficult conversations, how do we have them? I presently live and have always lived in these lands that are called considered Lumbee country. But I recognize the history of Cherokee, and so I hold value to that. So culturally, I'm giving honor and homage to my ancestors before going further. Because that's hugely important for us to do. Being a faculty at UNCP, I also consider that a huge honor, because it is a university that was founded by Native Americans here in Robeson County, North Carolina. So when I think about allyship, I'm reminded of our NASW Code of Ethics and what they tell us that we are accountable for doing. I think about the cultural competence standards, the self-care standards, and how we are required to be advocates, regardless, as you said earlier, if it's macro, meso, micro, it doesn't matter. Stand up and be an ally, stand up and be an advocate. But what I have found is there's a lot of those conversations that are not occurring. And that means there's a lot of the actions that are not taking place that I call accomplice, right? Co-conspirator, accomplice, the action behind the allyship. And that's what we need to do to make stronger in our profession, to make a change across the board. In the classroom, every person that we speak to and meet, we show it as well as speak it. The strength in our profession is within us, right? And that's what's going to make us stronger and change the dynamics for a stronger National Association of Social Workers, which will then make a stronger community regardless of where we live, and spread it across the globe.
Thank you, Kay. I always enjoy and learn so much all the times that I listen to you. Erica, she's not our last guest, but she's the last one that we're going to present, and then we're going to get around the table. But Erica is an award-winning mental health practitioner, a speaker, executive coach, entrepreneur, podcaster, philanthropist, and author of Latinx in Social Work. So walk, not run. Order that book. It's published both in English and in Spanish. So thank you for that contribution, and I turn it over to you, Erica.
Thank you so much, Madam President. I really appreciate being here and sharing space with all of you here today. My pronouns are her, hers, she, and ella. I am an Ecuadorian born, Latina, really proud of my heritage. I come from Quito, Ecuador, and my ancestors are Incas. And I stand here on the shoulders of all my ancestors. And I am here sharing space with all of you because it's so important for me to talk about the future of social work and to be able to serve all the communities and fight injustice. We must be a profession that makes our work accessible and intentionally cultivates talent from all backgrounds. I'm one of 3 social workers in my family, but there's not enough of us in the community to serve our communities. And I know that we must prioritize authentic diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that uplifts colleagues of colors and make room for a new generation that looks far different from today's field. So in my corner of the social work world in Elmhurst, Queens, in the epicenter of where the pandemic hit, I am sitting here and I'm chipping away at the bias that we experience as Latina, Latinx, as Latinas, Latinos, however we want to identify social workers face. It's been a decade into my career, and I saw how many ideas were routinely dismissed, but then praised when a white counterpart or coworker shared it later on. I was dismissed many times, how I was passed over for promotions in favor of white colleagues, how I was routinely the first in the room, a person of color, or even a social worker my clients ever worked with. It's lonely and it's been infuriating and exhausting, and to constantly be aware of all of this discrimination and not have the same be true of other white majority peers. That's where this all came about. I found solace in working with other accomplices. I love that you said that because that's exactly what I was thinking. There's allyship, there's accomplices. And together we validated the experiences of having microaggressions and in social work, schools and workplace, and share similar slights. And they understood how identity was layered into everything we did, the intersectionality of all of identities, because we're not We're not monolithic. We're not the same. And by doing this in passing, it really brought an opportunity for us to really educate in the schools using our own personal narratives. That's how Latinx and social work was born. It was a place where we created space to share the burden that's holding the weight of whiteness and honoring our identity in the profession. So after we published this book, it went into specific schools of social work, and we started having really deep conversations about our personal journeys through resilience and growth in face of trauma, because it's trauma. And collectively, these stories speak to institutional barriers that are insidious in the profession and the urgent need for more culturally humble care. So we celebrate this, but yet at the same time, we have so much work to do because it's just the beginning. We collaborate with many people, but we need more allies in the room. We don't want this book and we don't want our stories just to sit with our community that can identify with us, but we want it to sit in places where they may not have thought about, wow, with that sentence or the way I approach that situation, I didn't realize the impact. We want everyone to lean in and to really understand through our personal narratives the harm that is done through microaggressions and discriminations. And we also want to make sure that our future, the next generation, feel supported, feel acknowledged, feel seen, feel like they belong. And so we are so excited to continue this work, which is just the beginning, and it's not the norm. We represent multiple communities who are working to center the liberation and futures of Black and Afro-Latina and ex-comunidad. And we understand that the label of Latina and X has historically whitewashed the voice, presence, and capacity to act against anti-Blackness more readily and with understanding of our critical role in this world. We're going to continue to do this work. So thank you so much for having me here.
Well, let me just kind of get back here. Thank you, everybody. You are all joining me now in my home, the land of the Lenape. We're sitting here in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and we are all together to have this conversation. And so, I like theater too, so I'm going to be a little dramatic here. Uh, all of you are in my home, and we're just talking and talking, and we're like, do you believe this social worker said this to me? Because Erica, what you just said, we are not monolithic. And this takes such a toll. It takes a toll on explaining why I need to make you feel comfortable in order to say, did you just say that to me? How many of you feel that at times? How do you handle a situation where people just don't see you? I'm an African American woman, and I know I'm in a leadership role, and I know that I'm NASW president. But if I walked into a room with a white person and myself, this used to happen to me when I was at Westchester University, and my assistant, left hand, right hand person, Cindy Stringari, students would always walk in and say this to me. I'd like to make an appointment with her, the department chair. She would always say, why do you think I'm the department chair? And the students would get all flustered, like, well, I don't know. She's the department chair. And they would look at me and I said, I know you, she's white, I'm Black. She had to be the department chair. What makes us, and I think, Elizabeth, you talked about this a little bit, where white is, our whole world is built on whiteness. That white people are the best. And I'm not saying that there are not some that do some great things. I believe that all people contributed to this society. But, why is it that, or this is a great question. Do white people examine themselves? Do they do the work that I do all the time to make sure that I am being nice to everybody in the room?
So,
Elizabeth, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take that. So I first want to call on the words of Whitney Dow, who is the founder of the Whiteness Project. And she says, until you can recognize that you're living a racialized life. And this is to white people, right? And until you can see that you're having a racialized experience in most moments, every moment of every day, really, you cannot engage people of other races around the ideas of racial justice or doing work around that. And so I feel that for folks that are co-conspirators, it's our, white folks that are co-conspirators, it's really our duty to spread that gospel and help people to see things a different way. One metaphor that I often use, I saw in a cartoon, it showed a glass fish bowl with a fish in it, and one fish says to the other, "How's the water today?" And the other one says, "What's water?" And if we think about white people in our society, they're not seeing that everything is framed around rightness. So helping people to see that is a piece. We need to see all cultures, but I think white folks, in order to do anti-racist work, need to see that white piece. And that's very difficult. People don't want to see it. People don't want to own it. And that's when you get conversations or responses like, "Oh, they're talking about white privilege again." And I think it's my job, and all white people's job, to unpack that. And it's especially important to do that by modeling. And as I said, throwing yourself under the bus by saying something you did that was racist, intentional or unintentional, whatever it is, but showing that it's okay to talk about that. And it's okay to talk about seeing the world in a new way and reflecting on yourself and trying to do better. I hope that's a helpful response.
Sure. Somebody else jump in.
Yeah. As you were talking, Elizabeth and Mia, I was started thinking about the self-awareness. We are always saying that we must be self-aware, and I know in the classroom it's one of the big things that I teach to my students. But there is an assignment that I think we could all gain from doing, and it's called developing cultural awareness. But in this assignment, I think would be beneficial for all of us, no matter who we are, no matter how large of a title that we hold, is to go back and do an autobiography incorporating the meaning of cultural competence. Who am I? What is my position in this world? What has been my experiences? Talk about the intersectionality and apply it to what we know and how we communicate, and just go through all the different steps of that assignment. And I think that if we could all revisit an opportunity just to do an autobiography, we may have a more successful awareness of ourselves and how we can see those potential biases and what may be the reason for those biases being present. And sometimes you realize that it may be unconscious, right? But once we realize it, do something about it, right? It's, that's hugely important. So I think it would be great to just revisit and write our own autobiography, but plug in the social work terminology to ourselves, just as we do with our clients, right? We teach our students to do that with our clients. Let's apply that theory to ourselves to get a better understanding of who we are.
Dr. Locklear, my head is nodding vigorously. And when I started out and I talked about that, if we are talking about doing systems change work, and if we are talking about co-conspiratorship or whatever level you're at, it has to first start with ourselves. And I appreciate, Dr. Slater, your encouraging and inviting and even invoking white folks themselves to do it. But I'll also extend that invitation to those of us who have experienced marginalization, because we too have been acculturated through the gaze of whiteness. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, the work that Dr. Erica, get me right, but the work that Erica just talked through is this kind of recognition of how proximity to whiteness has impacted culture, one's own culture. And white people have to have that conversation with themselves. Because when we do a historical analysis through a racial lens in America, it reminds us that white people too had to separate themselves from culture in order to get proximate to whiteness. And so this centering of whiteness is so great. When we ask the question of who were the last, European cultures that became white, right? And many would respond, the Italian and Irish. And so when we understand the historical analysis and we understand the framework of inequity, it actually gives us permission to name it so that we can then address how is it showing up in our world. And so, and I want to give a shout out to the producers that are doing a lot of backstage work, but I posted Brian Stevenson's Guiding Principles of Equity. And I lift these up and I lift up Brian Stevenson, his team, the Innocence Network, and everyone who's affiliated. But these guiding principles of equity first remind us to do this work with, not for. That really helps to eradicate some of the saviorism, right? Some of the I know better than you, right? Mm-hmm. But then this get proximate to the problem, realizing that people alone are not the problem, that anything that is worth understanding, we must get close to. And so we that's important. But this third one, the attempt to change the narrative. There are narratives, and I'll speak from my intersectionality and dimensions of diversity lens as being Black, as being a woman, as being someone that grew up in the Midwest, right? All of these dimensions of diversity that show up in me that we even have to unlearn. Because it is important for people to understand, especially those who have been minoritized and marginalized, that there is nothing wrong with you. And so I want people of color in particular to hear this. There is nothing wrong with you. There is nothing wrong with the width of your nose, the sound of your voice, the curve in your hips, the kink in your hair. There is nothing wrong with you. And that doesn't mean that we'll never be wrong. But for us to understand that first about ourselves opens up our opportunity to really separate ourselves from thinking that we must change things in us in order to be more acceptable. And so I just appreciate us having that in the forefront of our minds, that then gives us permission to then be able to show up and be a partner with others, because we first done the work with ourselves.
Yes, Stephanie, you remind me of the Dunbar poem, We Wear a Mask, and as African Americans, or at least for me, you get up and you put on this mask every day because, you've learned the lessons from your parents' and it was about survival, smile, be nice to people. It was about either do that or something's going to happen to you. And so taking that mask off and saying, I am okay with who I am, is sometimes difficult. People sometimes will want you to, African Americans, or at least with me, you probably learned, I'm a passionate person. And I used to tell my students, you have to understand you're getting an A in my course if I'm doing this. If I'm just like, oh, that's okay, you're failing, and so when you use that passion, people will say, oh, I feel like I'm in a hostile environment. How do you handle that? How do you handle that switch coding that people do sometimes?
I'll jump in on that, because as a Latina, we're often stigmatized and stereotyped as fiery, passionate, volatile women, and it comes up, and it has come up for me in so many places. It's like, oh, there she goes again. You know how sassy Latinas are. That's like a serious microaggression, but it's everywhere. It's in the media. It's everywhere. My daughter, it was interesting. My daughter, she's Afro Latina. She is doing a project in school, and it was this topic. And I said, oh, I love that. Let me help you. Let me help you. And I started like pulling up some research and just looking at just how the media affects that. And it is everywhere. And I feel like the way I've handled it is that I really asked those questions. I'm like, what do you mean by that? Like, explain to me exactly what that means. because I'm just being really passionate about what I'm sharing. Because I don't think you heard me the first time I shared it, when I was really being careful. Because sometimes we try not to take up as much space in the room because we're like, uh-oh, they're going to say we're angry. They're going to say we're fiery. They're going to say all of these things, these biases and these microaggressions that come up. I'm like, I'm sorry, I said that before, but I guess now I just had to say it with a little bit more and I'm not going to be apologetic about it. And it takes time to be that strong and confident. It took me a lot of time. It took me many, many years. It took me a lot of therapy, and it took a lot of accomplices and a lot of peer support to help me find that voice. And then, but once you have that voice, and even in my therapeutic practice, I'm working with my clients, they're predominantly experiencing harm in the workplace. That's basically my clientele. It's predominantly experiencing harm, and we have to kind of really unpack it because it triggers all these wounds in us as kids, as when we were trying to assimilate into environments when we did not feel, nor did we did not feel like we belonged, nor were we embraced. So it's not that we don't feel like we're belong. We weren't embraced. We weren't embraced, period. So that's that feeling. And so just really kind of moving through that wounded child and finding your voice and working with someone, even if it's a coach, a therapist, other peers, support, find it, and don't be apologizing for owning your voice.
So Kara, how do you deal with assimilation? The assimilation. Everybody wants to assimilate to be white Americans, right? But do we really want to be white Americans? I mean, the beauty of the United States is our diversity. I mean, I always say the beauty is that you can touch everyone. But Kara, how do you handle that in the AAPI community? This hate that's all of a sudden. But it's always been there. Let's be honest. It's been there since the Chinese Exclusion Acts, right? So this is not the first time that there's been hate against the Asian American population. Japanese people were hurdled onto trains, taken to 13 different states. They lost everything, all of their possessions. And yet that losing face, that is something that is really important to them. How do you see this in social work? How do you help your students see this?
The thing that's really interesting that I was thinking of is one quick thing that I will share is my research focuses on gendered racial microaggressions among Filipino American women. And in my findings, it actually leads to trauma. And the fact that my findings were significant in that it actually shows that positive, significant effect between those variables. It was mind-blowing. And I was doing my research at a time where the Georgia shootings happened. And they were women who were targeted, Asian women working as massage therapists. And in the Asian community, we had been telling people something bad is going to happen. We've dealt with this before. It goes back to the Page Act. And we were constantly led to be seen within the white community, particularly as the model minority. And we've been constantly held up against that. And that the COVID pandemic brought it up again, but even fourfold. Now, here I am at the most segregated location in New York. I'm on Long Island, and I am not living in the city. And so I'm one of the very few Asians in the community where I live. And yet I'm terrified. I'm terrified to go into the city. I refuse to go into the city. My friend invited me to go to a concert, and I'm terrified to go alone. And I haven't had to feel that for a very, very long time. And so what this has done is brought not only layers of trauma, but intergenerational trauma as well. We no longer have the freedom that we had. We are completely and continue to be frustratingly so underrepresented, not only we're in the social work community, but in other communities as well. And we're constantly fighting to be seen, to be represented. And we don't want to be seen as white, but yet we are. And we are hated by other communities because of the model minority myth. And I like to go back to the history of, for example, Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X. They worked together. And I really focus on us working together. And that's what gets me into that classroom. That's what keeps me going in educating students who just don't know. And I think that a lot of times they're afraid to ask, and that they are just, you know, maybe even a little bit terrified because they don't want to be judged. And so I'm here to basically say, if there's something that you don't know and you want to know, it's okay to ask. But at the same time, like, it's a double-edged, you know, sword, that, you know, it's tiring. It's tiring, that tokenism, right? That form of microaggression, the tokenism, is exhausting. And so while we talk about social media and we talk about certain shows, that's not enough. And that's not enough to teach people about our different cultures. And I think if we really take a step back and look, we can find a lot of things in common with each other and work together.
So what I've noticed as a leader in social work is that we've got a problem. We've got a problem in social work, whether we want to recognize it or sweep it under the carpet. As I said before, the statistics show that 70% of social workers are white. You know, I always say that racism could just like women's equality happened when men voted to allow women to vote. Racism could stop in America if 70% of the people said, we're not going to do this anymore. They would change laws and do things. I mean, you'd always have people at the peripheral, but we could have a better country. But right now, the human stain of racism is growing on us, just like my shirt. I wear this shirt that's all color because the human stain is growing. And although people are saying things like, okay, I'm with you. No, you're not. You know, when those shootings happened, if every home in America didn't talk about those shootings to their children, no, you're not. Even though something doesn't affect you, you still have an obligation to address it in your home. But I have seen things in social work, and maybe it's because we can read things where social workers aren't looking at primary sources anymore. They are perpetuating in the gossip. They are taking sides and on Twitter being nasty and using names to make people like, whoa, where are you coming from? They don't know you yet, they judge you. What's happening in social work, and what recommendations do you have for us to get it cleaned up?
Well, I love that question. And I would say that this is not new. I mean, there is no system
Right.
that is absent of isms. And I think, you know, one of the key pieces for me is acknowledging that isms thrive in silence. So, President Joyner, even what you're doing today in creating space and platforms for us to talk, and I know talking sometimes get a bad rap, right? But wherever our mind is, our actions follow. So we have to get our minds there. And so because isms thrive in silence, us creating space, brave spaces and safe spaces or safer spaces are extremely important in being able to have these type of conversations. And then I think that, you know, as we think about, and I talked about this just a moment ago, but even the origin of social work, us getting real with that, because that's what our conversation was about, is, you know, who was social work even for and who was casted out? I mean, there are still classrooms within the social work discipline that don't talk about the women of color who were very integral into transforming, right? And so those are, once again, though, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Dr. Slater, with this centering of whiteness and the narrative that we want to share. And so I think that by us having these conversations and encouraging ourselves to acknowledge so that we can do the work to address, it then better positions us to be able to then do the work within our own respective institutions, within our work, because we all have to be curious. And that's something that for me, we talk about this. Curiosity is a lubricant for change. And so when we begin to get curious, curiosity over judgment, when we begin to get curious, it gives us permission to not only ask how things became about, but also say, then how can we begin to change them, or where does the shifts need to take place? And so I think really being able to create and cultivate that culture within our respective spaces gives room.
Mm-hmm. Stephanie, those are such great points that you made. I was talking with one of my friends who's also a social worker, and in our conversation, she shared with me that, well, really, Kay, what it has come down to is being politically correct before looking at our code of ethics. And that's part of the difficult conversation. If I say something, am I going to be shunned, or because it's not politically correct? And when I heard that statement, I was so incredibly disappointed, but yet I knew that it was true, right? Because one of the first thing that we should be abiding by is our code of ethics, NASW code of ethics, not what is politically correct, which brings us back to allyship, right? And co-conspirators and accomplices, and bringing all of the populations back into the conversation and giving originality credit from where all of this come from. You know, sometimes I think about social work theory. One of the theories I think about is the narrative theory. And I remember when I'm thinking about it, I know that it was a new name, but it always existed, and it was called storytelling, right? And narrative theory is storytelling. Where did it originate? It wasn't given that origination, right? And there's so many other examples. But yes, increasing the curiosity, just as Stephanie has said, that's what another thing that we really need to do, increase our curiosity.
Go ahead, jump in.
So yeah, I love what you're saying about increasing curiosity, and I think curiosity is such a central element to being a co-conspirator. And I also think in terms of the need to lean into difficult moments about yourself or about the system you're working in, that's such a key part of being a co-conspirator, learning to sit with that discomfort and not running away. Dr. Angela Davis talks about the importance of anti-racist practice as opposed to just being non-racist, right? And it's about that action again. And she talks about how it's about consistent action. So I would say consistent curiosity, consistent bravery, consistent leaning in, and deep, deep listening to the folks that you're trying to be a co-conspirator to.
Yeah, and it reminds me far too often is also not only speaking, but looking at the structures, right? Looking at the policies. When, there are times when all of you as leaders will have opportunities to do things, but not through the same status quo. I mean, that's what gets us into trouble all the time is when we appoint committees. Well, who do I know? Well, I know such and such, but they all look like you. Right? So how do you make that table say, how can we get somebody else at the table? Right? How do we give up some of this power? Because we get into that. How do we give up some of this power to make sure that our table is inclusive? And I find that oftentimes when people are talking about diversity and inclusiveness, and maybe you, Stephanie, you talked about that belonging part. But they get to, this is just not by like kumbaya moments. Like, can't we all just get along to get along? This is about doing your business different, right? It's about looking at everything that you touch differently. That's what's going to bring about change, to not do it the same. I know I have a bunch of sister girlfriends that I could appoint to X, Y, and Z, but it's important for me to go find Kay. It's important for me to find Erica and Kara. It is important for me to even find you, Elizabeth, to come to this table. But if I don't do that, right? If I don't do that, then the organization remains the same. And I guess sometimes I wonder, are we thinking that deep? Or are we all just saying, way back when diversity was everybody have ribs and it's an African American day? It's just not an African American. It's my Juneteenth. I always tease Angelo McLean, our CEO, that it is not a day for barbecue. Right? Juneteenth is not a day for barbecue. I really wish Juneteenth was celebrated on voting day. It's a day for freedom, right? It's a day to exercise. This is not about going to the park and having barbecue, although some people do that and I have no problems with that. But let's be reminded what we fought for freedom, right? Why, we were slaves, we were beaten, whipped, our families were broken up, we weren't even supposed to learn how to read and write. It's not about celebrating with food, it's about making sure that everything that I touch, everything and every job that I have, I make sure that all of you all are at the table. So how do we help people understand that? Because that's a large task. Some people are like, oh, forget about it. I don't want to think about it that deep. But do you see it that way? It's like I see it. Kara?
I think it's something where we really need to remember why we came into the social work profession, and we need to be patient and less judgmental. And I love what Dr. Oh my gosh, your name is Dr. Alice K. Your last name
Locklear.
is Locklear, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So I really didn't want to mispronounce that, and I apologize for that. But I wanted to comment on what you were saying before about like politically correct, right? And I think that that's one of the things that when I observe my students having discussions, and we're having a discussion in the classroom, you can see the hesitation. You can see that in their eyes where they want to say something, they want to ask something, but they're afraid of being judged. And I think that one of the things that we need to remember is why we came into this profession, where we started from. Like Erica was talking about how she found her voice. We have students who haven't found theirs yet, and we're still learning about ourselves, right? And still trying to find it. And that's something, one of the biggest things that we can provide our profession is remembering where we came from, where we are now, and not comparing, but looking back to where we were and where we are now, and how we can pay that forward in working with those who are just entering into the profession. It's because it's really not so much, especially when you're in an educational setting or in a very big leadership position, it's not about us so much so, but it's about lifting up and elevating those who are coming in so that they can, basically it's like passing the baton over. Right? So that's how we can be upstanders.
And so I'm going to say this to all of my practitioners, because I know I've got people who teach, but I worry about the gatekeepers, right? We all have gatekeepers. The gatekeeping role is to make sure if a person's not ready, and it doesn't mean just academically, but if you know that they're not able to practice embrace our code of ethics, you can't let them out the door. But then when they get it, if someone happens to get out the door and they can't practice in your agency, you can't have a child welfare worker telling racist jokes and then going out there doing child welfare. What's our role and responsibility as practitioners to the profession?
I love that you asked that question, Mit, because when I think of gatekeeping, I think of it on so many different levels. I think of it as a licensure exam. I think of it as holding privilege in positions of power, and you are the hiring privilege, right? The hiring privilege. So I'm thinking about, and then also as we are LCSWs, LMSWs, and supporting our social workers to enter into the space of being clinical social workers. And I think of it, and that there's so much responsibility, but that there's systemic racism and all of those things that I just named. There is, like, all of it. And so when I think as an LCSW, I have a privilege already. I have a privilege. I'm privileged to practice with a clinical license and own a business and support others in their learning. I will not feel comfortable if I see that anyone that is working with us, for the community, is acting in a harmful way. Mm-hmm. And there are times that it has come up that I have noticed that that wasn't right. I need to kind of reel them back in and just kind of help them understand what that meant and how that came about and how harmful that was. And it can be very, very hard. So if you're a person in that privileged, powered position, you have to be brave enough and do that work to own your voice still and take up that space and provide that education, provide those trainings, provide those moments of making sure that they become self-aware. And I also think about how when the companies and organizations and they bring in incredible people that may not have the clinical license, but they may have retaken that exam over and over and over and over and did not pass it, but they probably have incredible skills because they've been working as frontline social workers in communities. I think about, wow, what's that injustice about as well? Because there's reasons, there's barriers that some of us are not able to pass the exam as quickly as others. So I think about all of those privileges, and I think about the gatekeeping, and I think about what is our role. And our role is to change the system, to train, change, and educate. That is our role.
So I'm going to ask some of our producers to put through some of the questions that people probably have, because I forgot all about, this happens with interaction. So there you go. And I'm going to segue back to you also, Stephen E., because I want to hire you as an organization change agent. How would you get, before we bring up Carissa's question, how would you get an organization to look at themselves at multiple levels?
Yeah, really great question. And it's a process. So much of what I've heard Erica and Dr. Tabag and others speak about is honoring the process. But it first starts with creating a space that whatever data we receive, whatever process we go through, that we can begin to build trust in it. Because what happens if you have a low trust environment and we begin to ask questions of people within said system? What kind of data are you going to get back? What kind of qualitative information? And so we really hone in initially on the importance of building space and acknowledging harm. Imagine if you're in a system, right? And people talking about change, but they haven't even acknowledged what has already happened. So the process of acknowledgement is key in any recognition, in any transformational process. Once again, going back to self-awareness and organizational awareness, there is a history to everything. And so we encourage our partners to get curious about the history. What is the historical analysis? Whether you want to move through a racial lens, a gender lens, right? This multi-identity lens scope that helps us understand what has happened and who has been harmed. We also ask questions like, who have we centered, right? And so beginning to ask those questions gives us permission. And then guess what? Because other people are watching. People who have been harmed by a system, they're checking, because you know what? It's like what James Baldwin says. I hear what you say, but I also see what you do, right? And he actually said it differently. I can't hear what you say because I see what you do. And so people are watching. And so there is a trust factor, a building factor that is important in that helps to then facilitate or foster a process that then helps us get proximate. It's almost like a hot stove. We're not going to get close to that if that thing is still able to harm us in ways that especially trigger us or remind us of that. So those are just some initial pieces. I lift up Brian Stevenson's work again. We see that as a clear roadmap that we begin to filter our actions and our process through that lens. And as you keep going through that, it also talks about this willingness to be uncomfortable. And so we talk about it in the frame of the mindset of moving from a culture of perfection to a culture of accountability. That so often our communities and our systems are built on the rigidity of perfection. And so guess what? People start pretending. They pretend to know. They pretend to care. They pretend all these things. And so things begin to be said, but actions don't show up, and it breaks that trust again. So we really work hard to be able to support organizations in transitioning and then moving to a culture of accountability, being able to practice what Dr. Slater's talking about. You know what? I was wrong about that. Or I've been doing some research and I think differently now about it. And when we can begin to exhibit those type of behaviors within our respective communities, guess what? It opens up a portal. And now people can be more honest about, you know what, I'm struggling. How would you like to be referred to? Can you, right now we go into more permission benefit. Now we really begin to be practitioners of equity through our method of cultural humility. And I think, Erica, you were talking about cultural humility. I'm so excited to see your work and your writings about this, because we talk about cultural humility, and it's not that cultural competency is a bad thing. We just simply believe that culture is far too dynamic to be competent in it.
Right.
And in a culture that is obsessed with being the knowers and the tellers, people who do not feel competent, they say, that's not for me. That's for the DEIB committee. Or that's for Dr. Slater. That's for Dr. Tabag. That's what they do. But in truth, we all have a responsibility, right, to show up in a culturally humble way. And so those are just some preliminary pieces, President Joyner, in what we believe are elemental, are really key elements in making change.
You're hired. Okay, now we're going to do some rapid questions because here we go. Carissa, what is the one thing you want allies to know about your community? This is rapid questions, social workers. I know we can elaborate, but rapid answers. Kara, you want to take that one?
Yep. The Asian American community, there's many, many subgroups. There's at least 26 subgroups, and there's also intersectionality within those subgroups.
Anyone else want to respond quickly?
I agree.
Okay.
Same thing.
Yes.
It's not monolithic. There are intersectionalities of identities, of culture, of even language. Even though we speak the same language, we have different dialects. We are very, very different, yet we identify as in an intersectional way. So we're not all the same.
And you know what? I think, say that again. We are not monolithic. There's
We are
not
not
one group.
monolithic.
There's not
We are
one
not all the
group.
same.
Right.
No, exactly.
Not one identity.
Not one group. We're not all, and this happens a lot. There's a lot of microaggressions. Oh, what part of Mexico are you from? Oh, hi, I'm sorry. Did I tell you that I was from Mexico? And believe me, it doesn't bother me if someone said that was Mexican, to be honest, because I love Mexico. I love everything about Mexico, but it bothers me when someone that is not Latino, Latina say that because they identify all Latinos, all Latinas as Mexican, and that's not true.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to for our allies to know the environment of our community. For example, here where I'm at in North Carolina, in Robeson County, is a huge rural area. We still have clients, we still have individuals that live without running water in their homes, and their homes are dilapidated. What can we do as ally to improve that?
Right. Right. All right. I saw that question from email. I'm in the office where one coworker says things that are racist. I feel like a coward. I'm afraid of speaking out and causing an argument. Should I work with HR or go to the manager? What do I do? We've all been in this dilemma, right? What do you do, Elizabeth?
Well, I think you start by creating a circle of support for yourself and developing a strategy. In some organizations, the manager may be the right way to go. In some organizations, going directly to the person may be the right way to go after you practice with role playing. And in some cases, it may be HR. I think so often people are afraid in these situations that they're going to get fired when this comes up for the person who said something. So I think this is where the concept of calling in as opposed to calling out, which may be seen as more threatening, is important. But it's important for a white ally to step in, I think, as an upstander, as Dr. Tabag talked about. This is where we need co-conspirators to step up and step in and assist in the process.
I was gonna, I see that Dr. Tabag also, that was the same vein I was on. Also engage in permission benefit with the one who you perceived has been offended without burdening them or telling them that they should be offended. And this kind of goes back to that first question, Mit, that you asked about, or that was asked about what should allies know, to to recognize and to learn about the fragility that exists within yourself, and how to not transfer that fragility and make it the burden of the person who you want to support. And making them burdened with making you feel okay. That oftentimes that exchange is exhausting. Right? And so be very, work on that awareness. Erica talked about finding your voice. We also have to find our awareness of what things feel like in us. So recognize what fragility feels like. When am I feeling broken and shattered? And I notice that other people aren't that tore up about it. What is going on in me? And it doesn't mean that you're right or wrong. Once again, we're not moving towards judgment. We're just simply getting curious. Why is this coming up in me in this way? What is going on? And how do I make sure that I am not burdening, especially if you are white, that I am not burdening someone else with trying to make me feel better? Now, someone say, well, that's not fair. Why do Black and other folks, get a chance too? Because systemic racism has created a space where we constantly turn to and care about the tears of people who identify as white. While other people who don't identify as white have to hold their breath throughout their day so they won't be looked at as crazy, angry, overly emotional, and unstable. So it's different. So that means we have to behave differently.
Those tears work sometimes, right? That Karen moment of I'm going to cry, right? Sometimes will work. And one thing that I would like to say to everyone that I used to always say to my students that I learned from one of my professors is never be afraid. When people are being racist to you, sometimes you got to walk away from a job. Don't marry a job where you feel like you go home every day with your stomach in knots. To be able to stand up sometimes is very difficult, but I assure you, you will land on your feet. Do not let anyone disrespect who you are. Hard thing to learn, but a necessary thing. Going back to being politically correct, why are microaggressions referred to as such when in fact it's aggression? I used to say that too. Microaggression, when it happens to us, is micro, but if it happens to a man, it's aggressive. We're aggressive. Why can't we just say aggressive? Pilar, you asked a great question. Somebody want to say why we water things down when it happens to people of color?
It's actually because of the fact that it is, there's different forms of aggression. And so there's different form of microaggression. So it goes back to racial microaggressions theory, which was actually at the core of my conceptual framework in my study. And so if you look at microaggressions, right, Daryl Wing Sue, if that's a really great, if Greg could please put that in the chat, that's the founding scholar of the theory. And originally microaggression theory started in focusing on the Black community, and Daryl Wing Sue took it and basically looked at other marginalized populations to expand it, right? And so if you look at microaggressions, they are basically different. There's 3 different forms of them. I'm just going to go through that really, really quick. And Pilar, you can always contact me and I can go over that with you. I'm more than happy to share that. But there's one thing that Dr. Sue refers to as microaggressions are death by 1,000 cuts. Because if you think of the cumulative micro trauma, right? Little tears over time. And that's why they're called microaggressions, because they actually are aggressive, but in small, cumulative, tiny ways that really also do lead to that racial trauma that we discussed earlier.
Dr. Carey, I just want to say thank you so much for saying that, because the chapter that I wrote is called 1,000 Little Cuts.
Oh, thank you. And we do know that when you look at it, and we have a guide that we will put up in the chat that Carissa worked on. But I quote Morton and Sue because that is important for people to kind of understand that cultural identity model that was developed. So other questions we might have out there. Anything else? 1,000 cuts, right? That is important to understand because things come at you every day from, where you live. If you live in an area, someone might come in, and I always laugh when people come to my house and I open the door and they say, "Oh, wow, you have a really nice house." First they ask is who's home? And I'm like, this is my house. Oh, they look around, you have a really nice house. And I'm like, what did you think it was going to look like? Now, to me, that might just my husband saying, "Oh, you're oversensitive," but I'm just like, how you going to go in somebody's house and say, "You have a really nice house"? Um, Now, I know I need to do work on that. I need to do work when I see people who walk up to me and say, "Oh, I like what you're wearing today." And I'm like, "Yeah, what? Whoa." I would not necessarily do that to
Mhm,
someone else. So I just
mhm.
told someone that I was in Atlanta, and a man walked up to me and said, "Oh, I really, really like your dress. You look so nice." And I just froze. Is that part of that 1,000 little cuts you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, that's what's so stigmatizing about experiencing microaggressions. It can create this hypervigilance. It's not just being vigilant about what is happening, right? But that sensitivity to it, which, by the way, I even want to be cautious, because who am I to say whether or not you're being overly sensitive or not? But what we know is that is part of when we talk about racism as a machine, that it is a mechanism that does not really require effort. That's why it's important for us to have a common language around racism. Because if we only think about racism in the sense of how most people do, as far as being a hate monger, then we miss how racism shows up in our own individual acts. That in fact, racism being racial prejudice plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power. Doesn't say hateful misuse or intentional misuse. So it's just important for us to understand just how deep these acts are and how it then begins to permeate all the things that are in us and around us.
NASW is getting ready to have a conference on June 22nd through the 25th, and I invite all of you to come. But the one thing that I always fuss about conferences is that everybody submits their abstracts. That abstracts are submitted. I'll go hear all of you all because you are now part of my village. But very rare is there a room for those real hard conversations. And I honestly think that conferencing has to begin to change a little to facilitate conversations that do what we just did here over this last hour and a
Absolutely,
half.
absolutely.
Because I don't want to have to submit an abstract to do it. I just really want people to come into a room. And so I think social work conferences, no matter what conference you attend, there should always be the opportunity to come and share and talk about the actions you will take, because if not, we just talk in the hallways and not really talk about the real issue. But I do want you to come to the June conference. Reverend Barber is there and is going to be one of our keynote speaker, and we're going to march with him the weekend before at the Poor People's March and Assembly that they're doing, which is taking action. As hot as it is in Washington, D.C., yes, we'll be out there and marching. And also on the 23rd, we will go to the Supreme Court, even though we know that that opinion is already written. It is important for us to have our voice to let them know that we in social work believe that women have their reproductive rights must be protected. So we at NASW will definitely show up and make sure that we translate that into the ballot box, because that's what it's going to take, is to make sure that your Scotts and all of those people, your DeSantos, that they're not reelected people. Come on, social workers. We work with the community. We can go out. We don't have to be D. It doesn't have to be D or R. Doesn't have to be red state or blue state. It has to be that everybody has their worth. And if we can live in a country where everyone has their worth, I'm okay with whoever's in power. But to where our country is sliding, we can't let it go that far. I wanna have you all have a closing moment. And Elizabeth, I'm going to ask for you to have this last, because I told people at the very beginning I want to create some work for people to do over the summer. I want them to find their circle of friends. And I want to make sure that their circle of friends does not just look like them, but if it does, okay, to ask that circle of friends, why do all our friends look the same? But I want people to have these conversations in safe spaces. What would you want if we have this opportunity to come back in September, and I invite you all back in September or October, what would you want people to think about this summer as it relates to what we just talked about?
So there's so much to think about. I want to go back to the two quotes that I talked about, which I find as guiding stars for me. Bell Hooks says, "What we do is more important than what we say or what we say we believe." And I think if people can reflect how their actions and how their thinking relates to that quote, to jumpstart their curiosity about the reflective process, that's one thing. And I think the other quote from Dr. Angela Davis, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. I'd like to see people break down what that looks like for them. What are they doing? Is it non-racist? Is it anti-racist? Are they taking that action? Because co-conspiratorship is making a sustained commitment, always leaning into doing that difficult work around managing our fragility, speaking about white folks, for example, and stepping up after listening to communities of color and seeing what needs to be done with folks, not for folks. So I think I would like people to engage in reflective practice around those ideas and do that in community. At my university, I helped to found a white accountability group. We also founded a group for folks of color to talk about fostering resiliency and dealing with some of the awful things that are happening in our country. And the white group did their work. The needs of the two groups are different. So doing this work in community is powerful. It can push us along. It can bring us along when we're flagging and we don't want to do it because it's hard. And for white folks, we're allowed to step out because of who we are and because of the whiteness in the world. Reflect on that. How can you stop the stepping out? I hope those comments are helpful.
Excellent.
I'm going to throw something out there that might be outside the box that I'm going to challenge for people to do. Go to a community that you don't obviously frequent. So for me, for example, I go to all of the communities, but I'd have to find one, right, that I don't frequent. It can be in a, some kind of restaurant or a store or a club or a house of worship, but become uncomfortable. Find a place to become uncomfortable and just observe and take things in. Work through that fear. That's what I'm not. It's not a dare. It's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Alice, I didn't know if you were going. You're unmuted, but I don't want to jump ahead of you.
Go ahead.
Okay. I would say to get curious. Get curious about things that are happening in you and around you, and just begin to ask yourself questions and ask questions within the systems that you are part of, and then allow that to drive and move you towards action. As we talked about, because it's a process, it takes consistency and it takes movement. And so those are really important. And then I would say that really figure out as you go through, and once again, I bring up Bryan Stevenson's Guiding Principles of Equity, really take a look at those and see, what does this mean in me? What does this mean in the systems that I'm a part of? And as we commit ourselves to this work, we've got to stop thinking about DEIB as separate and apart. But instead, DEIB is the lens, it's the framework in which informs how we do our work. It's not separate and apart from what you do every day, but instead it should inform how you do the work that you're already tasked with doing. And that does take a change in our mindset. And it also takes us seeing ourselves and understanding what our role is, how we become contributors to change.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say thank you so much first, Stephanie. Thank you for calling me doctor. I haven't earned my doctorate yet, but I'm considering it because it sounds really good. But I want to say that perhaps maybe not just like I would challenge everyone to really do the work every day. I would challenge everyone to really look at how you're looking at the world, how you are speaking to people, how are you addressing your thoughts in your mind, because it's those beliefs, those thoughts that really expose and cause the harm. So really kind of constantly reflect in, even if you have to write it to yourself, even if you have to find someone that can support you in doing this work, do it. So find someone to support you doing this work. It's not easy. It's not just going to anti-racist training for, 6 weeks or 3 weeks, however long. It's every day. There's going to be mishaps. There's going to be moments that you're going to just say, oh, did I just put my foot in my mouth? If you're thinking you put your foot in your mouth, you probably did. Process it with someone. Do this work every day intentionally.
And I would say step outside of our comfort zones and listen to the stories of those that you've never heard before. And even further, look at the interventions that we're so used to using, and look at the interventions that we're not comfortable with, and how can we bring those to use.
So I have a book, a little journal here that I encourage all of you all to get. And as you go through your summertime work, you sit back and you relax. I ask you to have conversations not only with yourself, but with your family. When they look at someone differently, ask them the question, why did you look at someone like that? When they bring their friends over, what happened to such and such? Ask the questions. Ask the questions, because the more you ask, the more you will show what you encourage and what you discourage, right? Because it all starts at home. It all starts at home. I also ask you, when you go to work, what is just one thing that you did that day that you will put in this book where you thought of somebody else being at the table other than yourself or people who look like you? What's that one time, even when your voice quivered, that you spoke up and you said, did you all just say that? I can't believe you just said that. Because it's going to take a quivered voice. It's going to be examining those root behaviors that you do day in and day out. That's going to change this. And then as social workers, know that just because you put the label on as social workers, that we don't always get it right. But we are willing to look at our own implicit biases that over time and time again that we do without thinking. That's what we just do. Oh, we do things without thinking. We eat at 6 o'clock because we've been eating at 6 o'clock forever. So when we go to Spain and they ask us to eat at 8 o'clock, we look at them like, whoa, why y'all eating so late? You must be weird. When in reality, the siesta is the best thing I've ever experienced in my life. And to be able to use the entire clock. Visit places that aren't the same places. I always laugh when I go to Europe. Everybody's like, oh, wow, bring me back this. When I say I'm going to the continent of Africa, I'm going, be careful. And I say to people, why do I have to be careful in Africa and not be careful in Paris? There's crime in Paris, right? So again, those are the things that you do, as we've heard over and over, looking at oneself. I really enjoyed today's conversation. I do look forward to having our conversation one time in person with wine flowing and a nice board of cheese and crackers and all of that we have, because that is what social workers do. We get together and we talk about the hard things that's going to make us better, not only for ourselves, but for the community that we have committed to serve. There are people out there that have real hard problems. They need our expertise. They need us to start where they are. They don't need us to come with our biases. All of them have to be left at the door. So improving our skills is necessary to be a social worker. Whether you are in school, and you get that degree, that terminal degree that Kara just got, it doesn't mean you stop learning. It's continuous learning. And because this is an area, we're going to look back on this and say, wow, 20 years from now, they were really sophomoric about their solutions, because we want this to grow. This is the best community in the world if we could accept people for who they are. So I thank you for joining me on my Essential Chats. This is the last one until September. I need a break, but I invite you to the NASW conference. I invite you to always give me some ideas for next year's chats. So just put them in or send them to me at president@socialworkers.org. I am happy to announce that I'll have one more year left as president. We will have our new president-elect join us on some of these chats, and as our new board members, and we're going to keep building on NASW. NASW is your professional association. Where it goes and what it does depends on you. And so, Elizabeth, Dr. Slater, I thank you again for having our interpreters, Rarity and Samuel. Thank you so much, because again, we took another step to being the world and making sure that everyone belongs. So thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening. Hope it's not too hot where you are, but enjoy the evening. Bye-bye.
Happy Pride Month from the National Association of Social Workers. Did you know NASW has long supported the rights of people who are LGBTQIA+. NASW launched a task force on gay issues in 1976 to ensure the association pushed for the rights of people who are LGBTQIA+. The task force later became the NASW National Committee on Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Issues, which continues this work today. NASW in 2000 was one of the first major mental health organizations to condemn gay conversion therapy. NASW long supported same-sex marriage, which the U.S. Supreme Court guaranteed in 2015. NASW in 2011 helped create the groundbreaking All Children Matter report that showed how children are hurt by policies that discriminate against people who are LGBTQIA+. The NASW Legal Defense Fund supports the rights of people who are LGBTQIA+ to foster and adopt children. The NASW Legal Defense Fund also filed papers in support of the U.S. Supreme Court's historic decision in 2020 that federal anti-discrimination laws protect gay, lesbian, and transgender workers. And NASW is advocating against recent anti-LGBTQIA+ legislation in various states, including Texas and Florida. People who are LGBTQIA+ have also held leadership positions at NASW, including clockwise from top left, past Presidents Gary Bailey, Gina Nastis, Darrell Wheeler, and Jim Kelly. Social workers can find resources to better serve the LGBTQIA+ community by reaching out to their NASW state chapter or visiting the practice section of socialworkers.org. Thanks for listening to our message, and happy Pride Month.